Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome to the February IPMG Professional Development Workshop 2018 Legislative Update, What You Need to Know. Today's workshop is going to be presented by Michael Leppert, who is the Director of Public Affairs with Krieg DeVault, and he is also IPMG's Legislative Liaison. Before we get started and I introduce Mike, I do just want to go over a few housekeeping things. First, in regards to the attendance confirmation that you will receive for attending today's workshop, what I have on the screen is an example of what that email will look like. So it will be sent within 2 business days to everyone that has attended, and it will be sent from IPMG's customer service. So the email address that it will come from will be customerservice@GoToIPMG, and it will look very similar to the example on the screen. It will have the specific title of today's workshop in the thank you area. It will be sent to the email address that you used when you registered. So if it is a different email address than the one you normally use, you'll want to look for that in that email. Also, you may want to check, if you don't think you received it, in your spam folder. It may have accidentally went to that. Again, that will be within 2 business days, so most likely you'll receive that attendance confirmation email Monday or Tuesday. But if you have any questions related to that, you definitely can reach out to IPMG's customer service at customerservice@gotoipmg.com, and we'll help you straighten that out. Also, would like to remind everyone that we definitely appreciate feedback on our workshops and would appreciate it if you would take a few moments to complete the survey that will launch immediately after the close of today's workshop. And as always, we will be recording today's workshop, and that will be available to anyone on IPMG's website, www.gotoipmg.com, again within the next 2 business days. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Michael Leppert. In addition to working with IPMG on legislative issues, Mike is the Director of Public Affairs in Krieg DeVault's Governmental Affairs and Public Advocacy Group. Mike has over 14 years experience as a private sector contractor lobbyist and has a broad range of experience, including administering education and youth treatment and state regulatory programs. He also advocates for public policy positions before governmental bodies, elected officials, and citizens groups. And we are very fortunate to have Mike with us today to share information about the current legislative session and how to be more effective in making your voice heard with your representatives. So with that, I am going to turn this over to Mike so that he can begin his presentation. Okay, Mike, you have controls and you should now be able to show your screen for your presentation.
Well, I can't see the screen anymore, so don't know.
Well, we can see your screen, so.
I could see your screen until you did that, and now I can't see the PowerPoint, the presentation.
Because it's showing what you're seeing on your screen. So we can see, for example, that reminder, your email reminder about today's workshop. So you just need to bring up your PowerPoint, and then we'll be able to see your PowerPoint.
Oh, I thought I was going to be in your system. So, sorry.
No, that's all right. So we'll just be able to see whatever you, there you go. There, that's it.
Now, how can I maximize that?
Do you want to click on it and download it and then put it in slideshow? That'll probably be the easiest way. There you go, down at the bottom where it says, just click on your PowerPoint. Mike does a great deal of speaking. Most often it is in person, so just one moment, we'll get this going. So if you just, like you were going to open the PowerPoint on your screen.
Can you see what my mouse moving around?
No, not now. No. Yes, now we can. There it is. So just, yes, there you go. And if you, it's probably easier to put it in slideshow, but you don't have to. You don't want to.
Where is that?
Go to home. Go to home.
Yep.
And then, yes. And then click on, up at the top, do you see it says next to animations, go to slideshow, and then click, before you click on anything, where it says use timings, unclick that, or it'll automatically advance. Right there, and now hit from beginning, and then you're good to go.
Wow.
There you go.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to open with an apology for that gigantic picture of me. I only look at that picture when I'm sending it away on my iPhone. I've never seen that gigantic size of me before, so if I scared anybody with the introduction, I apologize for all that. So it's good to be here, good to be with everyone. I've got about 30 or 35 slides that I want to go through, and a lot of it is about the process that goes on in the State House. It's a less entertaining version of Schoolhouse Rock, and it is about the state process, not the congressional one, but they're very similar. They're all set up state to state. They're all very similar, but there are some nuances, and I just want to walk you through our process so you can understand as you're looking at it, as you're involved with things, and think about how you would like to participate in that process. And so a lot of times when I give presentations, and what you're going to see in my introduction is that what I do is I talk about engagement a lot. And so that's really what I want to hammer on today, is how to participate in what goes on in the State House. So here are my plugs. Smaller picture of me, but still big on my screen. This is kind of frightening for me. I don't know about you guys. That's a copy of my book. That's my website address. I write a column every week. I'm working on my second book. So much of what I write is about government processes and engagement in the process, and then some of the details and some of the drama that surrounds all that stuff. So if you are interested, feel free to follow me on Twitter and look at my website. I publish columns every week, and they're published in the Indianapolis Business Journal, and the State House File, and on the Wire. So that's my website. We had a shooting this week, so that you can see what my column was about this week. But I hope you go there and enjoy, or at least engage in some of the discussion that goes on with the columns that I write. So let's get into it. Oh, I guess I have to plug my firm. Krieg DeVault is a full-service law firm, with lawyers in several offices around the state and in other states. Our largest offices are here in Indianapolis and in Carmel. We have an office in South Bend and Mishawaka, and then a significant office in Chicago. There are satellite offices in Atlanta, Minneapolis, and Florida. The practice groups: healthcare, not-for-profit, real estate, business litigation, estate planning. It's been historically a banking firm as well, and we have one of the largest government affairs and State House lobbying practices in the state. Probably one of the top 5 there. So those are our specialty areas, and that's where I work. So, the Indiana General Assembly. Many people confuse the Indiana General Assembly with the Congress. I'm not going to dwell on that. I'm going to assume that you know the difference. At the State House, you have a legislature that is made up of a House and a Senate, just like almost 49 of 50 states are set up that way. But our legislature is a part-time legislature, and the people there are referred to often as citizens, as if when you're elected to Congress, you cease to become a citizen. But we call it a citizen legislature because these are part-time jobs. They are not meant to be or designed to be full-time employment for its members. There are several members who are retired. They're lawyers or consultants and have the ability to do this part-time job, which would appear on the surface to be very much a full-time job based on the time commitment. But we have some teachers, which is a challenge. They usually are not allowed to work, not allowed to work much in the spring semester because they spend much of January through April here in Indianapolis away from their schools. But business owners that have the freedom to be away and to move their work around, farmers and retirees, they make up a big number of our members of the legislature. The House of Representatives all stand for election every 2 years to serve a 2-year term. The Indiana House is made up of 100 members, and they all have about 60,000 constituents, 60 to 65,000 constituents apportioned to them in their map. So every legislator in the House, every member of the House of Representatives has the same size based on population district as everyone else does, and that's following, and they're redrawn every 10 years, just like every place else in the country based on the census data. The Senate has stand for election every 2 years, and they serve a 4-year term, which is significantly different than Congress and their 6-year terms. So in Indiana, our 50-member Senate is voted on every 4 years. So half of them will be up for election in 18, the other half will be up in 20, and their districts stay on that staggered schedule throughout. Again, I got a little ahead of myself, 50 total members of the Senate, but the political breakdown of our Senate right now is a supermajority, 41 Republicans and 9 Democrats. So in our Constitution, you have to have 2/3 of the body, which would be 34, 33 1/3. So we need 34 members of the Senate present to conduct business. And since more than 34 are in the Republican Party, they can conduct business without the Democrats even showing up. And so we've been in a supermajority situation in the Indiana Senate for 6 years, I believe. 41-9 is the largest that it's ever been. Again, 25 members will be up for election in 18, and that may shift some, but we're not expected it to shift a lot. The demographic breakdown as of the 2016 election, there are 4 African-American members of the Senate and 8 women. So as you can tell, it's a very male-oriented, very white demographic in the Senate, and historically, and it's still the case today, historically an older body than those in the House. There are a couple of reasons for that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The House, again, made up of 100 members. The political breakdown as of the 2016 election is also a supermajority at 70-30, and again, to get 2/3 there, you need 67 members. So that supermajority is a little bit more tenuous than the supermajority in the Senate, but still the same. They have been a supermajority there for 4 years, I believe, and this year will be a very competitive House race with regard to that supermajority. The Republicans are expected to maintain control, but there is some optimism, I think, on the Democrat side in the state and nationally that there might be a slight shift in the number of seats that are held there. But again, it's hard to predict those kinds of things, especially in February, 9 months before the election. Demographic breakdown in the House, not significantly different than the Senate. There are 9 African Americans and 1 Latina and 22 women. So again, a very male-oriented body, a very white-oriented body, and the average age is younger, but not substantially younger. The average age would be younger just because there are a handful of rather young 30-somethings that late 20s, early 30s members of the House, and they don't really have a lot of young members over in the Senate. There are significant members of the House that are also over 60, and since I'm only 50, I can still call that elderly. Important websites, and I'm going to talk about process in a minute. The Indiana General Assembly website is a fantastic resource. There is so much information there, almost too much for people who don't spend a lot of time there. But I encourage you to go to the website and track. There are search functions to help find issues that you might care about if you're looking for keywords. There are bills filed by committee. These drop-down boxes across the top where it says information, session, committees, legislation. When you click on those, you can see legislation assigned by committee. So if you're interested in Medicaid issues or you're interested in other things like that, you can do searches and find your information very easily. And I'm happy to help search if anyone wants to ask specific questions if they're having trouble tracking down after the presentation and in the future. It's a great resource, and it's way easier to manage than the congressional website. Okay, the 2018 legislative session is referred to as the short session. In Indiana, we have two kinds of sessions. On even-numbered years, which 2018 is, we have short sessions, which was originally designed back in the 70s, I believe, to be set aside just as a session for emergency reasons. Over time, it has taken on the look as just a regular legislative session where just about any issue can be debated and discussed. What is usually not, and usually I mean by design is not to be dealt with in the short session, is our biannual budget. And that's what differentiates the even-numbered year sessions with the odd-numbered year sessions. In 2017, the General Assembly passed its two-year budget, and that is a constitutionally required action of the General Assembly in those odd-numbered years. And so we're halfway through, we're approaching halfway through that two-year budget, and there is no discussion of the budget this year. So the other part of the short session is that by statute, we must adjourn by March 14th. Sine die is Latin for last day. That's what that means. On the long session years, it's allowed to go until April 29th. And those dates sound extremely random, I think, to people who aren't in the State House every day. And the reason why they are random is because I'm sure they were negotiated by people who wanted it earlier or later, and that's how that worked out. It really doesn't have any connection to anything else. And there are bills filed relatively often of late to try and move those dates one direction or the other. But this is the established deadline date for this year, March 14th, and it's April 29th in the long years, the budget session. So this year, 438 bills were filed in the House. By rule, the House only let its members file 5 bills maximum, so there couldn't be any more than 500 bills. But 438 was the final number. And only 130 of those bills survived the first half, and I'm going to talk about this process in a second. In the Senate, a similar number, they were allowed 10 bills, but with 50 members, so that the limits would be about the same. They had 456 bills filed in the Senate. Only 172 survived the halfway point. So, in the House, 308 bills are already dead. That doesn't mean their issues are dead, and there are opportunities for those bills, for the subject matter in those bills to reappear, and I'll talk about that. But the vehicles and the actual documents that were filed in the Schoolhouse Rock example are already in the trash can, and a similar number of bills were killed in the Senate. Most of that in a short session is basically because of the calendar. There's just not enough time set aside to deliberate and consider 438 bills, or even half. I have found historically in the 20 years that I've been working in the State House that 20% of the bills that get filed is a pretty good predictor of what will pass. A busy year, maybe 25% will pass. And again, what's actually in those bills will change over time, and there will be lots of amendments and issues that get connected. But as far as the number of bills that become laws, that's usually a pretty good estimation. So the legislative process, very simple, and I'll go through this very quickly. First thing is that a legislator decides to file a bill for whatever reason, and that bill gets filed. And the first action that is taken after the bill is introduced is that it is read for the first time, which means that the Speaker of the House has that bill, or the President of the Senate runs that bill across the desk, and officially we call that a reading, and then it is assigned to a committee. So the first reading is the assignment of a bill to a committee. For a bill to proceed after that, it needs to be scheduled for a hearing in that committee and voted out, approved by the committee. So once a bill is approved by the committee then has a committee report sent to the body, sent back to the House or the Senate in this regard, and it is read and that committee report needs to be adopted, which then will lead us to the second reading process, the fourth bullet point on the slide. The second reading of a bill is the opportunity for the body to amend, to suggest and make motions to amend that bill. And so a second reading process on the floor of the House or the Senate is when every other member, whether it's the original member who filed the bill, any member of the committee, or any other member of the body, can come up with an idea that they think will make the bill better or different in whatever way. And so that's the opportunity for the entire body to amend it. Those amendments will all be voted by the body and must pass a majority of the quorum that's on the floor. After that, the bill is then moved to third reading. And the third reading is the final vote of the first run of the bill on the floor. And that's just an up or down vote of the bill as it has been amended or not through the process at this time. On a third reading, you have to have a constitutional majority. So in the Senate, you have to have 26 votes, and in the House, you have to have 51 votes for a bill to be approved on third reading. So in the first half of the session, which just ended about 10 days ago, all the bills that 130 bills that passed the House, all of them passed third reading. And at that passage, they're then referred to the Senate. And then it starts the process all over again. And so those are the two things that happened at the halfway point. So all of the 308 bills that were killed in the House did not make it through this process right here. After the bill switched chambers, again, they have to be read a first time, and when they're read a first time, that in effect is the assignment of the bill to a committee. And again, scheduled for a hearing and voted in committee or not. Second reading on the floor to offer it up for the rest of the body to amend it and vote on it or not. And then third reading is the final up or down vote or not. What you will see in the process with the 5 or 6 bullet points that were on the slide before and this one is that at every bullet point along the way is an opportunity for the bill to die. And the process is set up to make it very difficult for a bill to become a law, not on accident, but on purpose. And so all of these things have to occur. There is no shortcut around any of the things that I put on this list. Now, most often, bills are killed or they die or they fail to advance at the committee process. Once they come out of committee, more often than not, they are put through the second reading process and then moved to the floor for a final vote. But these bullet points are all procedural opportunities for a bill to be defeated and an issue to be killed in the legislative process. After we've gone through the second half, the legislators set aside a week or two, depending on the calendar, for what's called the conference committee period. And the conference committee period, you see a lot on TV in Congress with the Senate and the House negotiating bills like the tax bill and like the health care bills and what has been going on this last week, immigration bills. This is basically what the conference committee period is set aside for in our state house, but it is a distinct period in the process. So after we get done with the second half, the slide I just finished, bills that have been modified in any way, if a bill is amended in the second chamber, if it's not been amended, it goes straight to the governor's desk. But if a bill is amended, in the second bullet point on this slide, the author of the bill can either file a concurrence, which is a filing that he or she says he agrees with what changes were made in the other chamber, or he can file a dissent motion, which means that he or she disagrees with what happened in the other chamber. And if a dissent motion is filed, the bill is then assigned to a conference committee. When a conference committee occurs, what originally happens is the Speaker of the House will assign a member of the Republican Party, in our situation, and a member from the Democrat Party, the minority party, as conferees to the bill. The same will happen in the Senate. And at first glance, the first committee is always assigned a member from each caucus. On bills that are not related to the budget, that is usually the way it stands until an agreement is reached and a conference committee report is signed by all 4 members of that conference committee. After the conference committee has been signed by all members assigned, then it goes back to both chambers for a final vote. Very rare will the conference committee not be approved, largely because the conference committees no longer are signed unless they have the approval of their caucus. So it's very difficult for a caucus of the House Republicans to approve for someone to sign a conference committee report and then turn around and vote against it. So it has happened in years past, but most of those instances occurred before the current caucus procedure was in place. With regard to particularly partisan bills, like the state budget usually is, oftentimes what happens in the conference committee process is that if there are any dissenters from minority parties, those conferees can then be removed by the Speaker or the President pro tem of the Senate and replaced with members of the majority party, and that is how a conference committee on those partisan issues make it to the floor. But again, that sort of partisan move usually only occurs with the most of partisan issues, and 99% of the bills end up getting signed by all the conferees or they die in this process. Again, this is a very strenuous part of the process. It's compressed for time, and if there's significant disagreement about a bill, it's very difficult to get bills through the conference committee process without significant compromise. The purpose of a conference report is to resolve differences in legislation between the two chambers, and the committees consist of the members from each caucus, as I've explained. The noticing requirements, and this is a part of the process I want to set aside. It's very difficult to participate in the conference committee process. First of all, there's no requirement. There are noticing requirements of 1 hour and 2 hours, but as far as participating and engaging the public on this process, 1 hour and 2 hour notice doesn't mean much to someone who lives in Fort Wayne or to someone who lives in Evansville when the hearing is occurring in Indianapolis. And so participation in the conference committee process almost means that you just have to be in the building from start to finish, from the beginning of the process until the end of the session, which is what we do. We spend 16 hours a day in the State House during conference committee time as professionals, but it's very difficult and very uninviting and unopen to the public. But it's basically set up to be a negotiation process anyway. Most of this process is specifically set up for negotiation and not so much for public input. I covered all this a little bit earlier, but the 4 conferees must sign the report. The signed report then must be approved by both chambers, and then that's when the enrolled act then is signed and sent to the governor for final consideration. Indiana's gubernatorial process or participation is a little bit unique. The governor has 7 days to take action on a bill once it reaches his desk. The governor has 3 options once that bill gets there. He can sign it into law, or he or she can allow the bill to become law without his or her signature, which is normally just a political designation that the governor doesn't like the bill but doesn't dislike it enough to veto it, and then he can veto a bill that he or she would choose to disagree with. But here's the important part. In Indiana, we have a weak governor system. There's no line item veto authority, and the veto override only requires a simple majority of the chambers above. Now, that would seem to indicate that if a governor wanted to veto a bill, that it would be very, very easy for the veto to be overridden. And yes, the body in the legislature would have just passed it with majorities, so that it would be easy to assume that all vetoes get overridden. But what normally happens here, if a governor decides to veto a bill, is the negotiation process between the governor's office and the legislature, and other debate ensues after that. And oftentimes, in a situation like we're in right now, where the Republicans control both chambers of the legislature and the governor's office, if Governor Holcomb were to decide to veto a bill in Indiana, that would be a strong request that the veto be upheld. And so only when there are partisan differences does that override seem to be perfunctory. You would think that all vetoes would automatically get overridden, but many times the veto was upheld because the executive branch has expressed their concerns and worked on whatever differences they may have had on the issue itself. The veto override session usually doesn't happen until months later as well, and so that gives an additional amount of time. In the last 20 years, there are very rarely more than a veto or two that occur each year, and mainly because in Indiana, because of the weak governor system, it really is incumbent upon the governor to participate in the process and communicate and negotiate throughout the process before it gets to his desk. And so if a governor is sitting back and just waiting for a bad bill to come to his desk, hoping that a veto will make the difference, that's probably not a very good strategy for success. A strong governor system would allow for a line item veto authority, especially on budgets, and then the veto override would require 2/3, which is what the standard is in Congress, and a substantial difference in our state legislative process versus the congressional process, probably the biggest one that we have. So while watching the process and participating in it, it's important to understand the bill's status. If a bill did not receive a hearing in the House of Origin, it is more difficult to get a hearing in the second half. It doesn't necessarily mean that the issue itself is dead, and I'm going to talk about an example here in a minute. But there are plenty of reasons why bills don't get heard in the committee, in the House of Origin by the committee. The bill may have had a fiscal impact, and down here people throw those terms around and don't really define it or explain it very well when we're talking to people that aren't here all the time. The fiscal impact statement is twofold. One is there are plenty of state policies that can be proposed that would have a fiscal impact on state operations, meaning that it would raise taxes or raise revenue or raise fees, which would raise revenue for state government. It could also have an expense or a cost, which would obviously cause an expenditure that may not have been contemplated with the budget that's in place right now. And so we have a very strong fiscally conservative legislature right now. And quite honestly, even when the Democrats controlled the House during the first part of my career, very conservative. It's a very conservative fiscal state. And so anytime there's a fiscal impact, that is a red flag on a bill that sets a bill aside and requires further debate and further discussion before it moves on. But more often than not, especially in a short session like ours, not enough time is the biggest reason why bills don't get a hearing in the Senate. And then lastly, lots of bills get filed every year that are just not very popular. And so every legislator in every district has a constituency and has personal issues and has constituent issues that are unique to them, and oftentimes there's just not broad support for the idea. So a lot of people think that anytime a bill doesn't get heard and died, that lack of support is the biggest issue. Really, these other two things take a big chunk out of that number of bills that have already been killed, that there was a fiscal impact, or there just wasn't enough time to handle all of the bills on the committee chairman's plate. Two bills that I want to talk about, and the first one is House Bill 1317. Lana had asked that I talk a little bit about that for this particular crowd, and it is a bill that has a lot of issues in it. And so while I'm running my mouth, feel free to read a lot of this synopsis. This is a synopsis of the bill, and there are a couple of things in there of interest, especially to IPMG and those who are in the case management world. Scrolling down to one of the last bullet points here, or one of the last sentences here, that requires FSSA to study reimbursement rates and methodology for case management services for recipients of certain Medicaid waivers, which is basically the entire operation of case management service and provision and costs involved with the services that IPMG provides. That was an amendment and a list of items, a pretty detailed list of items, actually a very detailed list of items that was worked on. IPMG participated in that during the fall and early part of the winter to develop what issues we thought needed to be studied so that FSSA and DDRS could come up with what they believe the rates should be. Obviously, we're asking for the rates to be studied because we think they should be raised, but this is going to be a scientific study where it's going to be a fact-finding mission. So that particular language was added to the bill during the House Health Committee, the Committee on Public Health in the House. I was there, and the Indiana Association of Retired Facilities was also there to support that. We don't really have any negative feedback on that. This is the kind of thing, though, that raises a little bit of a flag because there will be a cost involved. Getting back to that fiscal impact discussion we had with the slide before, to do this. However, the study is not, the fiscal impact has not been something that has caused anyone to be overly concerned. The bill did not get referred to Ways and Means. in the House side, and we're not expecting it to have to be referred to appropriations either. So we're relatively confident that that is going to stay in the bill, and this is going to be something that will be done. If you have questions about this, we can talk about the bill more broadly at the end. It's being heard on Wednesday, by the way, February 21st at 9 a.m. in room 431. That committee hearing will be broadcast on the website. That's one thing I left out when I was talking about iga.in.gov, the legislative website. All committee hearings are broadcast on the internet. So once if you're following a bill, like you would, many of you will probably have interest in this bill, it will be live, and you can watch it from home, all the testimony and the discussion and the vote on this bill. And it's very easy to track down where that video is on the website. It's right on the front page where it will say watch the General Assembly, and it will direct you to hearings in 431 at that time. The next bill I wanted to talk about is Senate Bill 355, and this is the creation of a license for behavior analysts and assistant behavior analysts in Indiana. This was a bill, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you about this, is because of the process. This was a bill filed as Senate Bill 355. It was referred to the Senate Commerce Committee, where many of the licensure issues are handled in the Senate, but because of time constraints, did not receive a hearing. Now, we are working on modifying the language in the introduced bill and preparing that for an amendment into another licensure bill that will be heard either this week or next week. So while this bill is technically dead, the issue is still very much alive, and we are still working on finding a way to revive the language in someone else's bill that has licensure type language in it. So this is Senate Bill 355 for searching purposes that is dead, but it will probably reappear in another health-related bill that has licensure issues in it, and there are several of them out there. House Bill 1007 is a possibility that will also be in that committee hearing on Wednesday morning in the Senate Health Committee. And then there are other bills that came over from the Senate. Senate Bill 224 is another example where a modified version of the introduced version of Senate Bill 355 could be amended into. So the issue is the creation of a license for applied behavior analysts. 27 states currently have licenses, and we are following a trend. I think that most of those, the vast majority of those 27 other states have passed their licensure bills just in the last 5 years. That number is growing. And this is also the last behavioral sciences service that gets reimbursement from Anthem and from Medicaid that does not currently have a license in Indiana. So this is a unique sort of discipline in that regard. So to participate, I wanted to talk briefly about this. There are many people, and I talk to many groups throughout the year, who are intimidated or overwhelmed with what it takes to participate in the process. And what my book was about largely, that I showed earlier, and what I write about in my columns often is about engagement. It really is very, very simple. It's just that not very many people know how simple it is. And so the slide says types of advocacy, and there are, these are broad topic areas, but you can advocate in so many ways, and basically any way you choose. There are education and information sharing types of advocacies. There are targeted letters and one-on-one meetings and community forums and petitions. There are all kinds of ways to advocate. The best way to advocate is just to pick one and do it. And so we're going to talk just a little bit about that for the next few slides. If you have a concern, an interest, an idea, a complaint, any of those things with regard to state laws or government generally, I encourage you to contact your legislator and learn who they are, learn all you can about them, but mainly make sure that you're willing to participate. There are effective ways to do this, and there are ways that are less successful, but the number one challenge is just making the decision to go and make that communication, whatever format that you're comfortable with. So here on this list is meet with legislators in your district. obviously, for us, for people that are in the State House all the time, we talk to these people all the time while they're here in Indianapolis. But one of the most effective ways for us to advocate for our clients is actually to go and meet with them in their district, and potentially, ideally, is to meet with them with someone from their district. And one of the things that I think people who might be jaded or less impressed with the governmental process, most people are surprised when I say this, that there really isn't anybody who trumps a lobbyist better than a constituent. All of these guys that are down here, the men and women that make up these legislative bodies, are very responsive to their constituents, or they probably don't stick around very long. And so I've never really met a legislator that was successful at this who was not paying very close attention to what their constituents are saying to them. But some constituencies are more responsive and more active than others. So on this list, meeting with legislators in your district, very important. Building coalitions, coordinating education campaigns, hosting a day at the State House, and then creating a one-pager outlining major issues for your local legislator. These are the kinds of advice that you would give a group that already knows what they want, how they feel about an issue, and what they need to communicate. But there are things that are precursors to this. Mainly, it's never too early to start. The most important advice I can give to people is don't sit around and wait for something to get under your skin to participate in the process. Sometimes it's incredibly valuable just to speak up that you are in agreement with something that they've done, or that you support something that they already did, or that you believe that they feel this way about a bill, and you're with them on that. Expressing your agreement can be very important and very helpful to them. Scheduling one-on-one meetings is the most effective way to communicate, in my opinion. If they're going to hear from 1,000 people, then yes, emails and letters and those kinds of things are most important. But if you think you have a unique perspective on something, schedule that meeting. And again, if you're a constituent, it's pretty out of the ordinary for a legislator to say they won't take the meeting. What you're going to see throughout these slides is you're going to see things like this third bullet point where it says provide a fact sheet that explains who you are and who you serve. I believe that all legislators meet with constituents. What I will tell all constituents is you have to plan for the efficiency of the meeting, and you have to do well at that and be sensitive to that. So coming prepared and being able to leave behind something that will help that legislator remember who you are, what you were saying, and those sorts of things are all kinds of mnemonic devices that legislators need so that they can remember who said what about what. And the volume of communication that these guys receive is a real problem. It's not that they all have bad memories like I do. It's mainly that they just need to have themselves organized, and any communicator who can help that process is going to be one that's more successful with them. Constituents, just being a constituent is a huge advantage, but being able to provide constituent-based stories, things that matter to you in your district and your family or your business, are things that always strike a legislator or any elected official well. And then this last bullet point with the subpoints is important. Attending community events hosted by your legislators or other organizations, again, if you see an opportunity to participate, the first thing I tell new clients, just like I tell constituent groups, is if you see an opportunity to participate that has just been presented to you, like a community event, and you know your congressman or you know your state legislator or your state senator is going to be there, show up, be there, and don't be afraid to introduce yourself or reintroduce yourself. I introduce myself to legislators at least a dozen times before I have any confidence that they remember who I am. Now, they don't need to remember who I am because I'm not one of their voters, but I encourage you to take that approach just because of the dozens and dozens of people that they meet on a regular basis. And I tell my new clients this over and over. Even if you're not making an ask, that contact helps to establish a relationship. I always tell my new clients, it's always best to meet decision makers before you have that ask, so that they know that you exist and that you're supportive of the process, and not just meeting them just because you want something. For this group, the local public health community is an important group to stay a part of. I'm sure that you do in your professional day-to-day operation. The local business community is something that matters as well. We have a significant healthcare practice in the State House over here, and sometimes when you get into healthcare policy, people forget that these healthcare providers are also businesses that have all the same stressors and all the same challenges that every other business does. And so I'm constantly reminding our healthcare clients to not forget that you're also a business, and you also represent the kinds of interests that you'll hear from a local chamber of commerce or even the state chamber of commerce, and you should participate in those groups as well. And in other advocacy groups that come and grow from time to time. The example given here is the Hoosiers for Healthy Indiana. Emailing, calling, letters to the editor, grassroots, and grass tops. I want to differentiate these things. These are all great tools, and legislative offices that are well run will keep all of this as documentation to help them with their decision-making process. Grassroots is a call that you're going to make just as a constituent. If you're a constituent that cares about guns or cares about Sunday alcohol sales or cares about school funding, and you want to call and express your position, you are a grassroot. Grass tops is a concept that is not talked about in the public very often, but grass tops are people who represent opinion leaders and large groups of people, and so we like both whenever we're trying to advise people on how to advocate. If you are an opinion leader or you are a business leader that represents a group of people or as part of a business or a movement or a sector or a neighborhood, you become a grass top, and you become one-to-one slightly more valuable than a grassroots. Grassroots often are rated by how many people spoke up about whatever the issue was. Grass tops are what most legislators and policymakers refer to as opinion leaders. And so a combination of grassroots and grass tops contacts are something that are very important to any legislative campaign. Creating the one-pager is a lot like creating the fact sheet that was a couple of slides earlier. Legislators get trained very early to not take on too much in the form of documentation. As we become digitized, and there are plenty of people in the legislature that still like paper, it's still important to be very concise. And so it's very rare that you need to give a legislator more than one side of one page of information on the issue. Many times, if that is a provocative one-pager, they may ask you for follow-up in more detail. But I can go down the list of 150 legislators, and I know which ones are policy wonk types who are going to read more and more information. But probably 100 to 125 of them are going to be ones that want the bare basic minimum information so that they can keep their operation very efficient. So when you're coming to meet with someone or you're going to provide information, one page is, in our world, is very much the common industry limit on first meetings and information sharing. So we're coming up on 12:20, so I want to make sure that we have time for discussion and questions. I could go on and on. Lana, do you want to start doing that, or do you want me to continue?
I think you could probably continue for a few minutes, and that'll give me a chance then to kind of look at the questions that we have. And
okay.
All right. Okay.
Communicating your message. The last time I did a session with Lana and in the group, we spent a lot of time talking about communication, and it's something that I think people need to think a lot about. And one of the things that I want to drone on about for a minute is that this part about it's not always what you say, but how you say it, understanding the political climate and who you are communicating with. But this third bullet point, recognizing the priorities of your audience. How do your priorities fit with theirs? And what's important about that third bullet point is your own research and your own ability to listen to what your audience has been saying or expressing with regard to their stance on whatever issue it is. Whenever I hear people talk about communication, whether it's with legislators or with an employee group or what, a political gathering, It's very important to know who you're talking to, but it's also very important to be a good researcher, a good listener, and that half of communication is listening. And so a lot of times communication people think that communication means how well you can write a story or how well you can give a speech, and those things are obviously a big part of it, but it's always important not to overlook what I think is at least as valuable as all that, and that is the ability to listen and understand who it is you're talking to. So my pep talk all the time when talking is you need to make sure that you're talking and listening to what you're saying from the perspective of the listener. And so that's recognizing the priorities of the audience and how do your priorities fit with theirs. That will help you be an effective communicator if you're going to talk to a legislator, to know a little bit about them and understand a little bit about their experiences before you go see them, so that not just so that you can have a personal touch and talk to them about where they're from or what their kids might do or what their spouse might do or what school they went to, but also to look back and find out if they are prone to be for the issue or against the issue or involved with it, or they may already have some understanding that you should be aware of, a professional background sort of thing, or anything on social media. There's so much information to be found on legislators before you go see them, and I always tell people, know a little bit, if you can, know a lot about your audience before you go see them. So if you knew as much as you did as a business partner before you went to a meeting, you would tailor your message to match who it is you're going to talk to, and it's no different here. So, fourth bullet points, examples of how effective messaging can turn a hard conversation into an easy one. These are good examples here. So say, for example, you're seeking money for smoking cessation. You're wanting people to smoke less. It's easier to go in and say, we want to reduce the state's long-term costs for tobacco-related illnesses, as opposed to saying, I want you to spend money on my program. And it's the same example in the second sub dot there, where it says asking for money to reduce diabetes is a harder ask than talking about how reducing diabetes cuts healthcare costs. And those seem to be very nuanced and very basic, but it is a very important part of communicating with legislators. Expenditures have to be communicated as an investment and not just an expenditure. If you're looking for money to be spent on a program that's of value to you, the most important communication part of the message is what's in it for the state. It can't just be, we want you to spend this amount of money. It has to be the benefit of the investment, the benefit of my issue is that the state will be better off as a result of this investment. So, as I said earlier, I'm a big advocate of communicate. Call, write, meet, do whatever you can to be engaged in the process. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the number one way to engage in the process is to vote. And again, you're not going to get anybody who cheerleads for people voting more strongly than me. However, that is one day every 3 out of every 4 years in Indiana, and if you vote in the primaries, add a couple more days. Actually, to me, I think at least equal to that is an ongoing engagement and an ongoing conversation with the people who represent you. Make them familiar with you. Make it easy for them to understand who you are, and so that when you come to meet with them, they know that you're active and engaged. If you're active and engaged with your government, they're going to assume that you're active and engaged in your community and that you talk about this at the barbershop, at the grocery store, at the school meetings, at the sporting events, and that's a safe assumption for a policymaker to make. So if you're communicating often and you're staying engaged often, your value and your ability to affect things in the government grows exponentially. Here's more about the one-pager type information and relationship building. None of this is any different than it would be in any other sort of environment. But the last bullet point on this page is important. Passing a bill is often a multi-year process, and we often look at the political process as a continual process that never has a start or a finish. These guys are going to be done by March 14th this year, but there are a lot of bills that are being debated this year that won't pass, that will come back next year and may pass next year. It may take 3 years, it may take 4 years, and during that time, the public support for it changes, the public understanding of it changes, demographics change, and the priorities change. And so it's important to have a positive outlook that something that doesn't pass when you think it should, if it's important and it's of value, if you keep after it over time, your success rate continues to rise each year. How are we doing, Lana?
Well, we do have several questions. If you are, are ready to answer a few, we can do that now.
I'm ready.
And I'll just encourage everyone, if you do have a question for Mike, to please type that in the question section. We'll do our best to answer, or I'll have Mike answer them, and then we will provide that Q&A when we provide the recording and the slides on our website. So the first question, Mike, is House Bill 207 and 224 the only two that Senate Bill 355 may be added or amended to?
224 is a possibility. 1007, did you say 1007?
It says 207 in the question.
What I meant was 1007. And that is a House bill in the Senate committee on Wednesday. Those are the two bills that I think make the most sense. And why I say it makes the most sense is because there's already some licensure language in there, and that's the connection. But there were 5 or 6 bills that passed that potentially a new licensure issue could be added to. But the reason why 224 and 1007 make the most sense and probably should be the ones monitored is because of germaneness there. So yes, watch those two bills.
The next question says, I have heard about an issue of gerrymandering. Is that an issue in Indiana? And if so, what can citizens do about it?
Yes, it is an issue here as it is everywhere. There's actually a lot of action going on in Ohio right now that they've passed a bill that will end up with a referendum to redo their maps or to create a new system for redoing their maps. There is also a court case in Pennsylvania or debate there on gerrymandering. Gerrymandering exists in every state, and every 10 years the maps have to be redrawn. Historically, the political party in charge after the session after the census is the one who draws the maps. And so that political party draws maps that are advantageous to them. And Indiana's maps are very gerrymandered for Republicans right now. And which is in part why the numbers of the political breakdown are skewed so heavily toward Republicans. This is a leaning Republican state. It is not a supermajority Republican state. And so when you see that 82% of the Senate is controlled by Republicans and 70% of the House is controlled by Republicans, that is a pretty good indicator that our maps are gerrymandered pretty significantly. The U.S. Supreme Court has heard a case on an appeal of the Wisconsin gerrymandering matter, and we expect a decision next summer from the U.S. Supreme Court on that matter. Now, there have been bills to address that in the legislature this year. Nothing significant will pass on that because, again, this is a partisan issue, and it would require the control of the Republican parties to basically give away control for that to change significantly. So the judicial system is going to have to issue an order for that to change. And yes, gerrymandering is a significant issue in Indiana, but that's just like it is every place else.
The next question asks, what will Indiana do as far as Individuals with Disability Act now that the law was removed by the federal government? And I think that is related, Mike, to what you and I were talking about earlier. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And then it does ask, I'm sorry, my screen changed, so I just got to move that. Removing this law will significantly limit the ability of our individuals to access their community. So if you want to just talk a little bit about that.
Right. Lana and I were talking before the session started about what passed the House this week was a repeal in some part. I don't know if the whole thing was repealed, but certainly a big shot at the Americans with Disabilities Act. It passed with 225 votes, which is not the entire Republican caucus. It passed the House, the U.S. House. It has to be passed by the U.S. Senate. Its prospects in the Senate are almost nil because the Democrats would not vote for that, and I'm actually kind of surprised that the Republicans did this. The purpose for that was because of costs involved with small businesses. That was the stated purpose, at least in the media coverage that I read. I consider that vote to be a political based and not with much of an outlook. I would call it a political mistake because it's my opinion that the ADA is a very popular act and not an unpopular one. But I'm not significantly worried about the repeal of the ADA actually making it to the president's desk, because I believe the Senate will kill that bill.
Okay, thank you. The next question asks if we have an issue that we feel needs to be presented as a bill, how do we pursue that? Should we find a legislative sponsor or more than one, prepare a draft?
Yes, one thing that I did not cover is how the actual draft occurs. My advice is that you go to your legislator with your issue, and that you talk about your issue in terms of the policy that you seek, and not try to write the bill in legal speak or in legislative speak, but go to your legislator and present the policy that you want. For example, you want say you want potholes to be filled within 24 hours of their appearance. You would go and just say, this is what I want the law to say. And if the legislator thinks that that's a law that makes sense, he'll take that provision and go to what we call the Legislative Services Agency. And that is an agency of the General Assembly that will take those kinds of ideas and turn them into legislative speak for you. And in that process of creation, the legislator usually works with the person who came to them with the policy to say, is this what you wanted the law to say? And so Legislative Services is who manages the website. They're made up of a bunch of attorneys and fiscal analysts and some technical people in there to communicate with the public, but also to do all the bill writing and the management of the statute. So the legislators serve as the go-between between the idea people, which often are constituents, sometimes they're guys like me, and the people who actually are the keeper of the laws. And so that's how that process works. Yes, go to your legislator and go to them with the basic idea, and make Legislative Services turn that idea into a bill.
Great. The next question asks, does a bill that is passed in the House have the same number in the Senate?
Yes. Yes. What happens with a bill is, I had House Bill 1317, for example. That bill will always be House Bill 1317. The Senate is dealing with House bills this week. They don't translate into a Senate bill. However they were filed is how they stay. Now, the author of a House bill is always a House member. When they send it over to the Senate, they assign it to a Senate sponsor. And so in the House of Origin, that's where the bills are authored. In the second House, it's where they are sponsored. And so that's the differentiating factor. The Senate sponsor of 1317 is Senator Charbonneau. That the House author of 1317 was Representative Kirkhofer, and those two happen to be the chairs of the respective committees. And so that's a little bit further explanation on that.
I think we have time for a couple of more questions. The next one says, obviously, Indiana is a fiscally conservative state. With that in mind, is there any legitimate conversation amongst legislators regarding addressing the DCS/foster care crisis and opioid addiction? My representative is asking constituents about mandatory drug treatment, but how could they possibly fund that?
Good question. There was a lot of talk about those two, especially on the opioid side, about doing something about the crisis. A lot of states that are demographically set up like Indiana have been hit particularly hard with the opioid addiction crisis that is sweeping the country. There's a lot of talk about doing things about it this year, and quite frankly, they don't have much to show for it as a body. We kind of knew that they were going to be strapped for that because it's not a budget session, and to do big things, they were going to have to spend money. And since this isn't a budget year, the timing wasn't good for that. How I would have argued that we had a crisis last year too, and we're going to have one next year as well. So the will to do big things on the opioid crisis has not really, they haven't really shown their ability to do that just yet. But one of the things that I think being patient has helped with, at least with the General Assembly, is that money from the federal government is starting to become more and more available. Just with the reauthorization of Healthy Indiana, HIP, was the opportunity for $80 million worth of grants that were not available before that reauthorization occurred. And so those kinds of things are starting to make themselves more available. I think on the opioid crisis, federal funding is going to be a big part of the solution there. On DCS, the study that the investigative study that was assigned to address the underperformance of the agency is really very early. They put out one preliminary report which showed that their data systems were awful and needed to be updated. I would expect next year that, if not before then, there will be some work done to do the data system part of that. But I think that politically, the most important thing is to show an acceptance of the fact that this is always going to be a difficult agency, and there isn't some magic wand that can fix it this year, and then you can just ignore it for 5 years without it deteriorating again. And so there have been big movements to clean up and improve DCS in my time in the State House, but what often happens is after a bunch of money and a bunch of new ideas get thrown at it, they tend to turn around as policymakers and ignore it for a few years until it deteriorates its way right back into a crisis, and that's where we're at right now. The price tag will always be big, the problems will always be challenging, and we just need to come up with a systemic way of never letting it get out of our vision.
Thank you. There are several more questions, and I feel like we probably are out of time, but I will share those questions with Mike so that we can receive his response to those, and then we'll be able to share them. So I know there's several more really good questions. We just need to be cognizant of our time factor, but I will share those with Mike and ask him to give us some information on them. The last thing that I would like to say is that, well, first of all, thank you, Mike. Quite a few comments in the comment section stating how informative and helpful this information was, and ways that we all as constituents can be more active and advocate for issues that are of importance to us. Part of the new person-centered individualized support plan process that is being implemented by the Division of Disability and Rehabilitative Services does include a section on advocacy for the individuals that are supported through the Medicaid Waiver Program. So I'm very excited about those changes and the ability then for individuals to develop a plan on how they want to be able to advocate for themselves. And that also includes voter registration, ways to be active in their local government and state and federal government process as well. So looking forward to being able to expand on that as that program rolls out more here in the very near future. So Mike, thank you again for taking the time to be with us today and to share this information. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you found the information to be helpful. And don't forget, there will be a survey that will launch as soon as we end today's workshop. The next professional development workshop with IPMG is scheduled for April the 20th. So we will not have one in March, but we will be back again in April on Friday the 20th from 11:30 Eastern Time, 10:30 Central Time, and the information and registration for that workshop will be announced soon. So with that, thank you everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining us.